Good morning. Welcome to your final video for our English 110 Intro to Literature class. Today we'll be talking about Joan Didion as well as your final essays and some other odds and ends to wrap up this class. Let's talk about the essays first. Most importantly, they're due tomorrow, Wednesday at noon on Blackboard. I'll be grading them quickly, so please do make sure you get those in. Stuff that's turned in late, I'll be traveling, so I'll try to take a look at it. But it's pretty important that you get this one in on time. Also, a couple points about our essays. The most important one to make is that writing an essay is sort of an intellectual journey, and you know a lot more at the end of that journey than you did at the beginning. So it's important when you're writing, let's say when you're writing that first draft, it's important to know that by the time you get to the conclusion, your intro is going to look pretty simplistic. It's not going to be as sophisticated or complicated or deep or as in-depth as it would be if you wrote it later, if you wrote it after you've written an entire draft and conclusion. So one thing is you've got to go back. You got to go back to that intro and sophisticate it, to bring in some of what you learned along the way that goes beyond, that transcends your original intro. Because remember, when we start our intro, often, or with the thesis, that's sort of our first thoughts on the subject when we haven't thought that deeply about it. By the time you're done with the paper, you've thought pretty deeply about it. You're going to want to go back and rewrite that intro. Amend and transcend that thesis in your conclusion, but also when you're going back to edit that intro. So, and also let's try not to spend too much time sort of throat clearing in our intros. I don't want a definition of morality from Merriam-Webster's. I don't want 8 sentences on morality in general, sort of the throat-clearing, vague sentences before we get to the text. You can have a couple sentences in there, but then let's get to the text and try to let the direct textual analysis drive it. Another point on these essays, I think it will help a lot if you try to get a really rigorous editing process in place. I know some of you have the habit, most of you probably have the habit of writing these on deadline last minute. And that can work for you, but it's hard to get distance from it, enough distance to have sort of a critical space where you can see it for what it is, not just sort of see it with rose-colored glasses like we do while we're writing it. So ideally, you can take a few days off in between your first draft and your final draft, and that will give you the distance. But I know a lot of you, especially in this abbreviated summer term, are not going to be able to do that. What you'll try to do instead is find some other way to get a critical distance from it. And what I would recommend is to try to print a draft of this, read it aloud to a friend, yourself if necessary, but ideally someone else. You can even record it on your cell phone using the notes or the record function. And read it with a pen in hand. So whenever you're stopped, whenever it feels awkward, just make a mark that you can go back to and know you have to fix that sentence. Also, you'll find that when you're reading it to someone else, you'll see it in far starker light, and some of it will just not seem quite right to you. And you're going to have to go back, and editing means more than correcting some spelling error. It can mean rewriting a whole paragraph or changing out a paragraph, that kind of thing. So let's try to get that critical distance in some way. Reading it aloud, you'll be surprised at how bad it is. It happens to me too. It happens to professional writers, who will read their own stuff aloud and just cringe and say, "Ooh, there's a cliche there. There's a passive sentence there. There's a fact that I didn't adequately document there." Going through really critically like that. So let's try to really do that this time and make the most out of it. Also, today's your last day of the blogs. This week, I'm just looking for 1 primary post and 4 comments. So I will be tallying those blogs up and reading on there, and participating. I'll see you there today. Make sure you get those in too by, let's say, Wednesday at noon. And that leaves us Didion. It's been my pleasure being your professor. I hope this format worked for you. It's been strange to stare at myself and not you as we're talking this stuff over. But I've interacted with a lot of you on email and other places. And I've really seen some growing sophistication and complexity of your literary analysis just on the blogs and in the papers. So that's been nice. It's a challenging format, I think, online, but a lot of you have done a lot on your own to really get something out of this class. So thanks for that. Joan Didion, born in California in 1934. She's alive, a New York City resident now. She's had a sort of interesting life. She's published a lot of nonfiction as well as some fiction and literary criticism. She's a well-known critic, especially, and literary essayist. Known for started with her book "Slouching Towards Bethlehem," which was a collection of nonfiction essays, and she had a bunch of other well-received, pretty famous nonfiction books. The White Album is one. Most recently, she wrote a book called "The Year of Magical Thinking." Um, if it sounds like a happy book, that's also the same year that she lost her daughter, age 39, and her husband, who was in his late 50s or 60s. So it was an incredibly tough year for her. And she wrote about grief, but she also sort of investigated the whole process in the death industry along the way. So a very interesting writer, one filled with anxiety and dread, and whose life has borne those emotions out, but who also has had a great eye and ear for what's happening in our society. And in this time, she seems to be casting her critical gaze on morality, our use of the phrase morality, and the other sort of loci, the centers of moral authority that we cite, whether they're the Bible or our reason, or in this case, the one she's really going to indict, conscience. How when we say, I'm taking a moral stand on this issue because my conscience tells me to, she wants us to question that, to put that into doubt and say, what do we really mean when we're saying that it's a moral imperative? And what are we talking about when we say we're listening to our conscience? How much can we trust it? How much can we trust other people's conscience along the way? So when she starts here, she talks about bodies, right? Why do we stay with bodies? Why do we not let them lie out? A pressing concern right now in the wake of this plane crash in the Ukraine, and the treatment of the bodies there is very much an issue. So she's saying that it's more of a social code to Didion than it is some innate moral sense we have. It's something that we've sort of come to agree upon on what we can and cannot do in society in order to live together. So she seems to see that conscience tends to be a disguise for pragmatism, a rhetorical stance we use to impart moral authority to our choices, many of which are not moral, as well as part of a social code that is tacitly agreed upon by most people in society, but not necessarily based in some morality from above, some conscience we have that allows us to see what is moral and what is not, what is right and wrong, good and bad, etc. So she really wants us to sort of question it when we're asking whether something is moral and where we get our authority and our ideas of what it is. It's interesting when you're reading her, this is a little bit freeform. I mean, she's in Death Valley for some of it. She's looking into various sort of anecdotal narratives to support her points. But it's more of a commentary, right? It's sort of exposition roaming around about this topic. For Didion, this is someone who had a great influence of Hemingway. It's interesting for a feminist writer, one who writes about women's issues at times, to have to cite Hemingway as a major influence, because others have called him misogynist at times. But as a craftsman of the word, as a literary stylist, she cites Hemingway as an inspiration because he says so much more than he puts on the page. He uses the omissions, the space in between his sentences, the unspoken, to fill out his writing. And she's trying to do a lot of the same thing. So at times she will really pull back from telling you what's happening and try to involve you as a reader in a way where you have to react to this. She's sort of calling you into question. And what she's asking you here is, when you're operating when you are behaving in your life in a way that you think is moral, and in a way that is explicitly moral, as in you're trying to be a moral person or a good person in acting that way, she wants you to question it and say, what do you really mean by that? Is this a disguise, a rhetorical disguise, for your pragmatism and self-interest? If it's not, does it have to do with this social code, this tacit, implicit social code that we all live together? Or is there some source of moral authority that we can really rely on, whether it be the Bible or our reason, other sources of moral authority, that can tell us when something really is a moral issue and when we're acting on it based on our moral sense or even our conscience? Where the heck do we get what we feel in our conscience is good and bad. I think these ideas can be applied to a lot of what we've been reading lately. They can be applied especially to things like the Martin Luther King essay and the Tim O'Brien, probably to some of the stories I've read like Battle Royal. So let's try to deconstruct morality in these as we're writing about them on the blogs, and definitely in the essay if you choose the ones that involve direct appeals to morality. That's what I've got for you today. As usual, fairly short, and hopefully we'll draw some of this out and play it out to its natural conclusions in the blogs. I will be available and checking email all day as well as tomorrow morning to try to answer any questions you have about your papers. I can look over a thesis for you, or an idea for your outline, for example, of what your structure of your paper will be. So get in touch with me on email, and good luck with your papers. I hope you've enjoyed this and got something out of it, and I also hope to see you on campus. I'm teaching a number of classes in person, including American Literature until 1870, which is the early American Lit class in the fall. I think there's, as far as I know, there may be some seats left in that. So if this piqued your interest about literature, I'd love to have you in person, where we can do a lot more than we did online in terms of understanding this literature and breaking it down and enjoying it, ideally. Okay, well, have a great week. Good luck with your papers. I will have them back to you quickly and with your final grades, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thanks a lot for listening.